30 years ago, in February 1996, I was at work in London when a 3,000-pound truck bomb was detonated by the IRA. I was in a building about 200 yards away when it went off. The physical experience of being that close to that bomb is something I will never forget. And the psychological aftermath lasted a very long time indeed. And that was just one bomb. And only 3 buildings were completely destroyed. And 2 people died. And fewer than 50 needed hospital treatment, and only about 100 were injured by shrapnel and flying glass. For scale, 3 days ago, the Israeli Air Force claimed to have dropped 5,000 bombs on Iran. And Iran has launched hundreds of ballistic missiles and thousands of attack drones. Thousands of buildings have been blown to bits all across the region. Close to 2,000 people. 2,000 people have been killed in a week. We can only imagine how many more have been injured and how many more have been traumatized by what they've experienced. The IRA bomb in London in 1996 marked the end of a ceasefire. And many feared that the Troubles, roughly 30 years of armed conflict, of horrendous brutality on all sides, that it would all start back up again. The Troubles had directly impacted tens of thousands of lives. And the wider impact was enormous. The hate between groups, between the Northern Irish and the English, the Protestants and the Catholics, the Unionists and the Republicans, the British military in Northern Ireland and the civilians there, the IRA and the UVF and the UDA, the hate and the enmity and the violence spanned generations. Neighbours demonized each other, groups dehumanized each other, congregations even were pitted against one another as sworn enemies, as the cycle of violence seemed unbreakable. But it did end. And some folks from both sides of the conflict have spent these past decades building relationship so that it stays ended. They have been intentional and have courageously spent a great deal of time and emotional energy in conversation with one another, and they've committed to learning each other's stories. They're in the process of healing together, and they know forgiveness has to be a part of that process. They're learning how to do that. And they've been teaching the rest of us along the way that it can be done. One woman whose father was killed by a massive IRA bomb has been in ongoing dialogue with the man who built, planted, and detonated that bomb for 25 years. As a result of this relationship that she initiated, as a result of this relationship, she now firmly and compassionately believes that an enemy is someone whose story you've never heard. Today's gospel reading was a long reading, a long story. This story in the Gospel of John is in fact the longest continuous narrative in the gospel texts, and in its reading and in its hearing, compared to most of our Sunday gospel readings, it kind of reflects the reality of meaningful dialogue, especially between two people who are from two groups who have long considered themselves enemies. Conversation here is a commitment of time and a commitment of effort. Now, by the time Jesus was born, there'd been intense hostility between Samaria and Judea for 700 years. And in the 2 centuries before Jesus was born, there'd been a number of significant escalations in the violences between the two groups. This wasn't just a petty regional rivalry. This was an enmity with deep roots, with identity as God's true chosen people at stake. This was a conflict people were prepared to kill for. Who could rightly claim to be God's true covenantal people? Who had the true authoritative scriptures? Which group had the divinely ordained right to worship God in their way and in their place? Which was Jerusalem for the Judeans and Mount Gerizim for the Samaritans. This long, long conflict was fraught with violence and killing. It was seemingly an unbreakable cycle of violence. Now, right before we pick up today's reading, John's Gospel says Jesus, who was on his way to Galilee, Jesus had to go through Samaria. He had to, the text says. Now, he didn't have to because there were no other routes, there were no other ways. There were. Perhaps he had to go that way because of the historic conflict, because of the history of violence, because there was a lack of relationship between these two groups. Perhaps he had to go because there was healing to be done, there was violence to end. Jesus meets the Samaritan woman and initiates a conversation. He engages with, speaks with, and listens to a person from the other side. Back and forth they go. She questions, he answers. She speaks, he listens. He speaks, she listens. She asks, he responds. Back and forth they go, listening to one another and learning about each other. There are no words of judgment. There's no insistence on change. Jesus issues no threat. There's no domination here, no imposing of power over the other. This conversation is no act of divine shock and awe. It is not a swift, decisive divine act to bring change, to force change. It's relationship building through conversation at the pace at which it unfolded. And this conversation is transformative. It's generative. Their shared humanity, their shared love of the one who created and sustains all life, that held the power to bring about that change. As a result of this one connecting conversation, the Samaritans, the ones who hated Jesus' kind, asked Jesus to stay with them. And we might imagine that his stay with them was a time of proper enemy-busting, humanity-affirming story sharing and attentive listening on both sides. We're told many more believed because of his word. Many more believed. Now, maybe they came to believe in a new way in the life-saving power of God or in the sanctity of all life. Maybe they came to believe there absolutely is an alternative to violence. That Jesus' way, the way of love and healing and forgiveness, is the way God calls us all to follow. Maybe they came to believe in the transformative power of relationship, especially because before there had been none. Jesus is God's decisive act of reconciliation in the world. God's way of drawing all the world into life-giving relationship. In Jesus is the truth of God, revealed as compassionate and abounding in steadfast love and mercy and patience. Patience for what's needed to heal division and bring an end to violence. Jesus came into the world so that we might be saved from the ways the societies we've built choose to keep killing and suffering and destruction in the world. Saved from deluding ourselves that there can be any other way to fullness of life for all, any other way to true peace than by actually going into those places where relationships are broken, choosing to go there, having to go, where there's no relationship, and doing God's work there, choosing connection and relationship and storytelling and attentive listening over an ongoing cycle of violence. Going there and taking with us what Jesus has taught us about healing and forgiveness in our own lives, going into those fraught spaces, those relationships fraught with harms done by both sides, choosing to go there regardless of who we think is responsible for it all or who we believe started it all. Choosing to go there with unwavering compassion and with humility and self-sacrificial love as Jesus did to end cycles of hurt and harm. We will never stop the cycling of harm by force, by intimidation, or by domination, ever. Jesus' way, one conversation at a time, shows the way each of us chooses to live matters. We change, and the world will change. Relationship is the way to end violence. Relationship is the way to peace. Because peace is not the stunned silence after the bomb explodes. It is not the silence that's full of grief or hurt after the building's been blown to bits or a life has been ended. Peace is not the forced silence of surrender or submission. Peace is not the absence of war. Peace is an end to wounding. It is the healing of pain. It is the process of forgiveness. It is the building of trust as we commit to hearing each other's stories. Peace is only possible through relationship. And relationship is only possible if we're prepared to go there, to choose to break the cycles of harm, to choose to listen to each other, all of us. Listen deeply and be willing to be changed by what we hear.